A horrible 6-year conflict befell Syria with a multitude of factions fighting for territories backed by a score of foreign players. The script for the war, as with Iraq in 2003, originated with Zionist partisans with Israeli interests in mind. From Oded Yanan to the Israeli clean break papers, the Zionist regime made it very clear what their intentions were in Iraq and Syria. American mass media had a uniform message that Assad must go for years until the Trump administration took power.
The world will not waver. Assad must go.
We both agree that Assad needs to go.
It is just further evidence that Assad has to go.
He is no longer legitimate and that he needs to go.
Assad is on his way out. We all need to be thinking about the day after Assad.
President al-Assad has lost legitimacy, that he needs to step down.
As I have said many times before, Assad has lost all legitimacy, and Assad must go.
He has stated unequivocally that Assad has lost all legitimacy and cannot conceivably continue to govern.
Assad has lost all legitimacy to govern.
We've also been clear that Assad has lost all legitimacy to lead.
What we've done is organize the international community, saying Assad has to go, and I'm confident that Assad will go.
After cutting CIA funding and support for moderate rebels, which was always a cover of plausible deniability to fund jihadist al-Qaeda groups, which wasn't a first for the U.S., the Syrian military and its allies were able to quickly deliver a cascade of defeats to the mercenary terrorists. In Iraq, after the U.S. made it clear that they did not back Kurdish secession and would not give them air support, the Iraqi forces chased out the Peshmerga in a mere 36 hours. The world must know that the U.S. was dragged into these conflicts via Israeli pressure and deceptions. As the president said, we have spent $6 trillion in the Middle East and we haven't won anything.
These are animals. You have to knock them out. You have to knock them off strong. You decide what to do after. You can't fight two wars at one time. If you listen to him and you listen to some of the folks that I've been listening to, that's why we've been in the Middle East for 15 years and we haven't won anything. We've spent $5 trillion in the Middle East because of thinking like that. We've spent and Lindsey Graham, who backs him, who had 0 on his polls. So let me just tell you something. We've spent. I only tell the truth, lobbyists. We've spent $5 trillion all over the middle. We have to rebuild our country. We have to rebuild our infrastructure. You listen to that, you're going to be there for another 50.
All right, Governor Bush, please respond.
It was never in American strategic interest to be Israel's enforcement arm in the region. With Saudi Arabia falling apart internally and Israel's plans for Syria wilting before their eyes, can the U.S. finally shake off these parasites of foreign policy and take a new direction?
Let Syria and ISIS fight. Why do we care? Let ISIS and Syria fight. And let Russia, they're in Syria already, let them fight ISIS. Look, I don't want ISIS. ISIS is bad, they're evil. When they start doing with the head chopping and drowning of everybody, these are really bad dudes. So I don't want them. But let them fight it out. Let Russia take care of ISIS. How many places can we be?
So essentially,
we have to get rid of ISIS, very importantly. But I look at Assad, and Assad to me looks better than the other side. And you know, this has happened before. We back a certain side, and that side turns out to be a total catastrophe.
Syria, Israel's invisible hand. Available New Year's for free. My gift to you. Please consider donating in the link below so we can make more future films on other topics.
أيتها الأخوات، أيها الإخوة، إن صمودكم هو الذي أعلن رسميا وفاة ما سمي زورا وبهتانا الربيع العربي، وأعاد توجيه البوصلة. فلو كان هذا الربيع حقيقيا لانطلق بداية من دول التخلف العربي. لو كان ثورة شعوب لنيل الحرية والديمقراطية والعدالة، لكان بدأ بأكثر الدول تخلفا وممارسة للقمع والاستبداد. تلك الدول التي كانت وراء كل نكبة أصابت هذه الأمة، وراء كل حرب ضدها، وراء انحرافها الفكري والديني وانحدارها الأخلاقي. تلك الدول التي كان وجودها أهم إنجاز للغرب وأهم سبب لنجاحات إسرائيل وبقائها في منطقتنا، ولا أدل على ذلك من موقفهم الحالي من العدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة. فأين هي الحمية والشهامة التي أظهروها تجاه سوريا أو الشعب السوري كما ادعوا؟ لماذا لم يدعموا غزة بالمال والسلاح؟ أين هم مجاهدوهم؟ ولماذا لم يرسلوهم للدفاع عن أهلنا في فلسطين؟ لكي نعرف الجواب لا بد من أن نعرف أن ما يجري اليوم في غزة أيها السادة ليس حدثا منفصلا أو آنيا. فمنذ احتلال فلسطين وصولا إلى غزو العراق وتقسيم السودان، ووصولا إلى محاولات تقسيم العراق التي تحصل اليوم، هو عبارة عن سلسلة متكاملة مخططها إسرائيل والغرب. هذا من البديهيات بالنسبة لنا، لكن منفذها كان دائما هو دول القمع والاستبداد والتخلف في عالمنا العربي.
With the Islamic State's empire in Syria crumbling before the onslaught of the Damascus-Moscow-Tehran alliance, the Israeli regime has become more vocal than ever in calling for the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad. Interestingly enough, Israel chants this war cry at a time when the administrations in Ankara and Washington, previously the leaders in such rhetoric, have abandoned open callings for the removal of President al-Assad as the leader of Syria, and are now working on salvaging what they can from the Syrian war via dialogue with Moscow, de facto admitting that it is the Russians who have the only genuine solution for resolving the conflict. Words aside, Israeli support for destabilizing jihadist factions in Syria has become more apparent than ever since the beginning of this year. In March, Israel carried out a strategic air raid against Syrian government forces at the T4 military airport, attempting to justify the strike by claiming it was targeting a Hezbollah military convoy. In the event, the airstrike was immediately followed by an Islamic State offensive, which attempted to seize the base from the Syrian army. However, the Syrian army was able to repel the IS offensive and, during the course of the preceding Israeli airstrike, shoot down at least one, possibly two, Zionist warplanes. 3 months later, in June, Israel stooped to a new low, revealing its support for terrorist groups in Syria even further. This time it provided tactical air support for al-Qaeda-linked militant groups attempting to seize the government-held town of al-Baath. To be clear, this was not a one-off airstrike that happened to be followed by a jihadist offensive. Rather, these were multiple airstrikes against the Syrian army over many days during the course of the jihadist offensive. The situation was made even more difficult for the Syrian army because it could not call on air power to hold back the jihadist assault. In the end, the Syrian army carried out an emergency gunline action by mustering every artillery piece and rocket launcher within about 30 kilometers of the city to lay down a wall of barrage fire onto the jihadist attackers, and then, after launching several counterattacks, managed to reverse all terrorist gains. In any case, Israeli airstrikes claimed 3 Syrian army tanks, several artillery pieces, and half a dozen machine gun positions. As of October 2017, the Syrian army and allied forces have, despite constant Israeli hindrance over the preceding months, managed to push the Islamic State all the way back to the far eastern fringes of Syria, reducing the terrorist group's empire in the country by about 75% since the beginning of this year. However, the question arises, why is the Israeli regime so hostile to the maintenance of Syria under President Bashar al-Assad? And why has this hostility turned Israel over the last year from supporting terrorist groups covertly, that is, with the asset of plausible deniability at its side, to openly, militarily supporting them, as we have seen in March and June? The fact that the Syrian government and Iran are winning the war is the answer, but this simple answer alone does not present the full picture. The proper answer lies in understanding the concept of Iran's strategic depth in the Middle East via land communications. This answer not only explains why Israel is desperate now, but why Israel and the United States started the Syrian war in the first place. Prior to the Syrian war, Iran enjoyed what could be called contiguous strategic depth throughout the Middle East. Massive international highways running from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus and to Beirut allowed Iran to transport economic goods and military assistance all the way to the Mediterranean coast and every Levantine country in between. This by no means gave Iran regional hegemony, but it did ensure that the country remained an influential power in the Middle East. Insofar as Tehran remains connected to Iraq, Syria and Lebanon via highways, Israel, who has sought Middle Eastern hegemony since the 1980s, can never hope to seize total control of the region. Israel's plan to establish itself as the sole hegemony in the Middle East can officially be traced back to the 1980s. In 1982, an Israeli foreign policy elite named Oded Yinon wrote an essay titled A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. The essay proposal was submitted to and accepted by the Journal of an influential Israeli strategic policy institute called Kivanim, which is Hebrew for directions. In his essay, Yinon suggested that the dissolution of Syria and Iraq later on into ethnically or religiously unique areas, such as in Lebanon, which in 1982 was divided into 5 sectarian and ethnically based provinces, is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front, a reference to the Arab nations east of Israel, in the long run, and that the dissolution of the military power of those states, Iraq and Syria, serves as the primary short-term target. According to Yinon, this state of affairs, the dissolution of Iraq and Syria, will be the guarantee for peace and security in the area in the long run. Of course, this has proven to be anything but the case. Yinon's focus on dissolving the armies of Iraq and Syria as a priority objective to be accomplished in the short term revolved around his understanding that the Syrian army today is mostly Sunni with an Alawi officer corps, the Iraqi army Shiite with Sunni commanders. This has great significance in the long run, and that is why it will not be possible for the ruling leaderships of these countries to retain the loyalty of the army for a long time, except where it comes to the only common denominator, the hostility towards Israel. Thus, according to Yinon, provoking the dissolution of the target country's armies along sectarian lines is seen as a necessary precursor to destroying unified, armed opposition to the Zionist state, and as a core compounding factor in the sectarian balkanization of the countries themselves. Going into detail, Yinon argued that Syria should be balkanized in a way so that there will be a Shiite Alawi state along its coast, a Sunni state in the Aleppo area, another Sunni state in Damascus, hostile to its northern Sunni neighbor, and the Druze who will set up a state, maybe even in our occupied Golan, and certainly in the Horan Plateau and in northern Jordan. Whether Israel plans to physically colonize the spaces that it is currently destabilizing in Iraq and Syria, in accordance with the Yinon plan, or whether destabilization is an end in its own right, is subject to debate. In his proposal, Yinon made no suggestion for the need to physically take over regions within Iraq and Syria for the purposes of Israeli colonization, rather placing emphasis on the need to simply break up these countries into smaller sect and ethnically based chiefdoms that preferably wage war against one another. What should be understood is that the act of destabilization alone does serve the purpose of dissolving regional powers and thus ending regional competition for the power that is seeking hegemony. In this respect, the conquering of nations through traditional imperialist methods such as colonization and military occupation is no longer required. Rather, one can control such countries by simply preventing them from being in control of themselves. There are three main benefits to this specific practice. The first being that this is a covert approach to establishing hegemony, being far less blatant, and therefore attracting less attention in the eyes of international observers than methods revolving around direct subjugation. Secondly, it is financially cheaper and requires less military and human resources to accomplish and maintain regional hegemony through this approach. The third benefit is that this approach still allows for the economic exploitation of the target territories. By playing different chiefdom-like power structures against each other, the conqueror can then approach one of the different power structures and offer them an advantage over other localized power structures in exchange for economic concessions. A great example of this is Iraqi Kurdistan, where Israel receives 77% of its oil via trade with the Kurdistan regime in Erbil, who in turn receives political recognition from Israel in pursuing official territorial separation from Iraq. Before continuing on with cross-checking the protocols of the Yinon Plan with events that have unfolded in Syria, this report will take a brief moment to assess another target country of the Yinon agenda, Iraq. Writing about Iraq, Yinon stated, Iraq, rich in oil on the one hand, and internally torn on the other, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. Its dissolution is even more important for us than that of Syria. Iraq is stronger than Syria. In the short run, it is Iraqi power which constitutes the greatest threat to Israel. An Iraqi-Iranian war will tear apart and cause its downfall at home even before it is able to organize a struggle on a wide front against us. Every kind of inter-Arab confrontation will assist us in the short run and will shorten the way to the more important aim of breaking up Iraq into denominations as in Syria and in Lebanon. In Iraq, a division into provinces along ethnic, religious lines, as in Syria during Ottoman times, is possible. So, 3 or more states will exist around 3 major cities, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, and Shiite areas in the south will separate from the Sunni and Kurdish north. It is possible that the present Iranian-Iraqi confrontation will deepen this polarization. In 1994, Dick Cheney, who had just concluded his term as Secretary of Defense, was working for the now infamous neoconservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. In an interview, he stated exactly what the US thought would happen in Iraq if Saddam had been removed after the first Gulf War in 1991. He admitted that pieces of Iraq would fly off, creating a Kurdish region in the north, with influence by Iraq's neighbours, and a lasting sectarian ethnic quagmire, and that it would cost many lives. That is exactly what happened after the US invaded in 2003 while Dick Cheney was serving as Vice President for George Bush Jr. In other words, exactly what the Israelis desired is what the US predicted would occur if Saddam was overthrown.
Do you think that the US or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
Dick Cheney cannot feign ignorance about the likely results of the Second Iraq War. He knew exactly what would happen, and that it was not in US interests, and yet He became an architect for the war anyway by repeating the lies of the Zionist neoconservatives who had metastasized in every key department in the Bush administration. The Second Iraq War relied on a series of known deceptions. It is important to distinguish that these lies were intentional and not simply the result of incompetence. In fact, the intelligence analysts were purposely ignored, and a secretive office comprised of Jewish Israeli partisans was set up in the Department of Defense to circumvent the normal channels and processes and create war propaganda through deception. The office was called the Office of Special Plans. It was run by Doug Faith, and it was secretly met with Israeli generals inside the Department of Defense. The lies which sold the Iraq War relied heavily on Iraqi defectors, and it was promoted by like-minded ideologues in the New York Times such as William Safire and Judith Miller, a woman who went to jail for 85 days after ousting an entire covert wing of the CIA who were tracking nuclear weapons proliferation. The main cries to justify the war were concerning weapons of mass destruction. After the first Gulf War, Iraq was forbidden from possessing weapons of mass destruction. Well, it didn't have any, and the inspectors had said so. The pretext for war that Iraq was in violation of UN Resolution 1441, which stated they could not have weapons of mass destruction, was an outright lie. The lies which pushed the war and the professional liars which pushed the lies are as follows. Saddam has hidden chemical weapons under his palace. William Safire. Saddam has aluminum tubes which are really missiles for weapons of mass destruction. Judith Miller. Saddam bought uranium oxide or yellow cake uranium from Niger and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Michael Ledeen of the Iran-Contra scandal. Saddam has mobile weapons labs that have biological and chemical weapons like anthrax and VX nerve gas. Judith Miller. Senior Iraqi officials met in Prague and gave anthrax to the 9/11 hijackers. The origin of this one started with Israeli security forces who claimed to have witnessed the transfer. They lied, of course. James Wollasey then passed it to Gary Schmidt of the Project for a New American Century, another neoconservative think tank, who then published it in the Lockheed Martin-financed neocon news outlet, The Weekly Standard. Some of these lies are not even new. They had been saying some of these things since 1998 and rehashed the same propaganda in the early 2000s, which means it all started before the EU or the Euro existed. This wasn't done to protect the petrodollar. The US wasn't even buying Iraqi oil during the Oil for Food program scam and brutal sanctions that starved to death hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people. It wasn't done for oil. Oil imports from Iraq to the US haven't changed since 1999. This was a war done for Israel's regional ambitions. None of the pre-war lies start with energy companies. In fact, the energy companies were against it. Every single Iraq war lie originated from Zionist neocons and willing media participants. Judith Miller had been blaming everything on Iraq since the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, and even alluded to a possible Iraqi connection to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing in an interview with Charlie Rose's radio show. Hence it comes as no surprise that she continued the witch hunt in 2002 and 2003. The Israelis wrote the script on Iraq and Syria. The Israelis benefited from the war in Iraq. It was Israel's plan to take out Iraq before Syria, and they openly wrote about it. The same neocons who created the Office of Special Plans and manufactured deceptions about Iraq wrote their own policy paper echoing Yinon, infamously called the Clean Break Papers. Richard Pearl, nicknamed the Prince of Darkness, is the one who commissioned the policy paper, and he addressed it to the now current Prime Minister of Israel, his second time in such a role, Benjamin Netanyahu. This is an American Jew who worked in US defense circles within the Pentagon, issuing a policy paper for the head of a foreign state and only for the interests of that foreign state. In pointing out some of Pearl's policy ideas, take the time to ask yourself if it sounds like Pearl is writing about Syria and Iraq with any reference to US interests. Israel can shape its strategic environment in cooperation with Turkey and Jordan by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. This effort can focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambition, establishing the precedent that Syrian territory is not immune to attacks emanating from Lebanon by Israeli proxy forces. Most important, it is understandable that Israel has an interest in supporting diplomatically, militarily, and operationally Turkey and Jordan's actions against Syria, such as securing tribal alliances with Arab tribes that cross into Syrian territory and are hostile to the Syrian ruling elite. Of course, it goes without saying that along with Pearl, other Iraq War architects such as David Wurmser and Douglas Faith were all signatories to the paper. As with most Israeli-driven wars in the Middle East, the conflict in Syria, though planned out by Israel decades in advance, has seen the Zionist polity keep its own financial and military resource expenditure to an absolute bare minimum by involving, as much as possible, allied partner nations, namely the United States. To this end, declassified Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and State Department documents show that as early as 2012, about 1 year into the Syrian war, US intelligence circles were fully aware of the sectarian nature of the conflict, fully aware of how America and allied nations were backing this sectarian insurgency, and fully aware of the intentions of the jihadist militias waging the conflict in Syria. In quoting from leaked DIA documents, keep in mind that AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, are exactly the same jihadist polity as what we now know today as being ISIS, or the Islamic State. In clarifying the general situation in Syria as of August 2012, a 7-page DIA assessment noted that the course of the insurgency was taking a clear sectarian direction and that Salafist armed groups fighting under the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood and AQI, which is what we now know as the Islamic State, were the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. The DIA identified that AQI, the Islamic State, supported the Syrian opposition from the beginning, both ideologically and through the media. In support of the Islamic State-led insurgency were Western countries, the Gulf states, and Turkey. The DIA document concluded that should the insurgency expand and gain more strategic initiative in the war against the Syrian government, then there existed the possibility of jihadist militias establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality, a Sunni Islamic State, in eastern Syria, and that this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition, i.e. the West, the Gulf states, and Turkey, want in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of Shia expansion led by Iran. In fact, it appears that the recognition by US intelligence of the Islamic State as a somewhat deniable asset of the coalition against the Syrian government can be dated back 6 months earlier to February 2012 in a State Department memo that was readdressed to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton via an advisor named Jake Sullivan, which simply noted that AQ, Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, is on our side in Syria. Over the course of mid-2012 to mid-2015, Syria lost control of its entire border with Iraq, effectively isolating it from its allies in Baghdad and Tehran. This was possible due to the fact that jihadist fighters from western Iraq, namely in Anbar province, were simply crossing over from Iraq's border with Syria and dissolving into the ranks of pre-existing Syrian-based militias. Some would join the Free Syrian Army, others would join the Muslim Brotherhood armed wing known as Arah al-Sham, whilst others merged into the ranks of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, which is Islamic State. Whilst these militants fought in Iraq, they were considered by the US coalition to be terrorists. However, as soon as they crossed the Syrian border, they all of a sudden became moderate rebels as far as the West was concerned. In late 2013, al-Nusra was the dominant rebel force in eastern Syria and, almost overnight, all of its fighters in the region took up the ISIS banner, transferring 80% of the entire Syrian-Iraqi border to the terrorist group. There exists an audio recording of an interview between John Kerry, who was Secretary of State from 2013 until the end of the Obama administration, and Syrian opposition delegates. The recording was leaked in late 2016. In it, Kerry talks openly about how the US observed the spread of ISIS via eastern Syria and how the coalition allowed it in order to pressure President Bashar al-Assad to negotiate.
Russia is invited in by the legitimate regime. They were invited in, and we're not invited in. We're flying in airspace there where they can turn on the air defense, and we have a very different scene. The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching it. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him.
As of 2017, with the Syrian army pushing east, only a small section of the Syrian-Iraqi border has been reclaimed by the government. Non-government control of the Syrian-Iraqi border is now split between US-backed Free Syrian Army mercenaries, the Kurdish YPG, which is also US-backed, and ISIS. On the few occasions that Syrian government-led forces have attacked towards the Iraqi border in southwest Syria, the US coalition has responded by bombing them. The American excuse for doing this is the presence of a small coalition base near the Syrian-Iraqi border, called Al-Tanf, which it claims to be protecting from pro-government forces. Another area for Israeli focus beyond Syria's borders with Iraq is the Golan region. For decades now, Israel has occupied and heavily militarized the high end of the strategic Golan Plateau. In doing so, Israel has always guaranteed for itself the ability to see to a depth of many tens of kilometers its eastern border with Syria. However, in the grander calculations of Zionist foreign policy, even the Golan Heights are apparently not enough to secure Israel's future. When the Syrian war was initiated, the first areas the government forces were driven out of over the course of 2011 to 2013 were the Golan, Jordanian and Lebanese border regions. By this action, Syria was somewhat nearly double isolated by 2014, insofar as not only was it isolated from its allies Iran and Iraq, but almost from Hezbollah too, its primary ally in Lebanon. Over the course of 2015 to the current period, the Syrian army and allied militias, including Hezbollah, regained control over the entire Lebanese border. However, Syria's border with the Golan Heights and with Jordan in the Daraa region remain under the control of terrorist groups. With specific regards to the Golan region, how interesting it is to note that jihadist militias such as al-Nusra and the Islamic State control sections of territory directly opposite and connected to the Israeli border. The Israeli regime has never once complained about the presence of these Salafist jihadist groups on its border and has only ever clashed with these militias on extremely rare occasions. In fact, back in November 2016, a brief border clash erupted between ISIS and Israeli troops, and to this end, as Israeli ex-defense minister Moshe Yaalon admitted in 2017, ISIS resolved the dispute by apologizing to Israel. Ask yourself, when has the Islamic State ever apologized for its actions regarding anything? So now it is worth considering where the Damascus-Moscow-Tehran coalition stands in late 2017. Since the beginning of the year, the Syrian army and its allies, backed up by Russian air power, have regained the strategic initiative in the war. The great counter-offensive by the Syrian army began in mid-January in both East Aleppo and Homs provinces, and this has seen pro-government forces reach the middle Euphrates Valley region. However, shadowing this growing wave of success has been the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led coalition supported by American air power. The gradual retraction of the Islamic State's empire back towards western Iraq has seen both pro-government forces and the SDF gravitate towards the center-east of Syria in pursuit of energy resources and strategic boundaries. As mentioned earlier, attempts by pro-government forces to reclaim the Damascus to Baghdad highway from Free Syrian Army mercenaries has been directly challenged by the United States. To this end, Moscow is in negotiations with Washington to organize the relinquishing of the Al-Tanf base by coalition forces and ensure their withdrawal from southern Syria. Further north, Kurdish forces have taken full control of the M4 highway crossing into Iraq. Only in southeast Syria does the international highway running from Deir ez-Zor to Al-Mukmal to Baghdad remain up for grabs. And in this direction, both pro-government forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces are throwing in all their reserves of strength to try and secure it. Here, pro-government forces have an opportunity to re-establish at least one road corridor to Baghdad and Tehran without having to engage in intensive post-war negotiations with coalition-backed pseudo-polities. Regarding the full restoration of Syria's sovereign borders with the Zionist-occupied Golan region and northern Jordan, high-level negotiations between the Moscow-led alliance and the United States, Israel and Jordan have been underway for several months now to try and reach a diplomatic solution. The biggest obstacle to these non-military efforts is Israel, who, having failed to overthrow the Damascus government, at least seeks some guarantee under international law that Iranian-backed forces in Syria, namely Hezbollah, are made to keep a certain distance from the Golan border. It is also possible that sometime next year, pro-Damascus forces will launch an offensive to physically expel militant groups from the Zionist-occupied Golan border region. However, Israeli air power will likely carry out a bombing campaign, regardless if it means openly supporting jihadist groups, in order to turn back such an attempt.
The infrastructure, military infrastructure, economy is suffering. It's almost as if like Syria is going to fall into decay very soon, and the time is against you. In your opinion, how much time do you need to crush the enemy?
You cannot answer that question because no one claimed that he had the answer about when to end the war, unless we have the answer when they're going to stop smuggling foreign fighters from different part of this world, especially the Middle East and the Islamic world, and when they're going to stop sending armaments to those terrorists. If they stop, this is where I can answer you. I can tell you in weeks we can finish everything. It's not a big problem. But as long as you have continuous supply in men and armaments and everything else and logistics, is going to be long-term.
When is the last time you've spoken to a Western leader?
Before the crisis.
It was before the crisis.
Before the crisis.
Were there any time at which they tried to give you conditions that if you left the post of presidency, then there will be peace in Syria, or no?
No, with me directly, no. But whether they propose that directly or indirectly, it's a matter of sovereignty. Only the Syrian people will talk about this. Whoever talk about this in the media, in a statement, directly or indirectly, has no meaning and has no weight in Syria. So, no.
But, you know, do you even have a choice? Because from what it seems from the outside, even if you wanted to go, you wouldn't have anywhere to go.
Exactly.
Where would you go if you wanted to leave?
To Syria. I would go from Syria to Syria. This is the only place where we can live. I'm not puppet. I wasn't made by the West to go to the West or to any other country. I'm Syrian. I'm made in Syria, and I have to live in Syria and die in Syria.
Do you think a foreign invasion is imminent?
I think the price of this invasion, if it's happened, is going too big, more than the whole world can afford. Because if you have problem in Syria, and we are the last stronghold of secularism and stability in the region and coexistence, let's say, it will have a domino effect that affect the world from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and you know the implication of the rest on the rest of the world.
It seems inexplicably, whenever you eliminate one threat, say be it Ghouta, another threat seems to materialize, and this has happened repeatedly. Now we have the Israeli energy minister who is threatening that his country could, quote, liquidate you and your government. Are you afraid? Are you afraid, and how do you take that threat?
Since we were born, I'm talking about my generation, and most of the generations now in Syria, we lived under the threat of the Israeli aggression. This is something in our unconscious feeling. So to say that you're afraid while living with the same threat for decades, this is nonsense. Israeli has been assassinating, killing, occupying for decades now, for more than around 7 decades in this region. But usually they do all this without threatening. Now, why do they threat in this way? This is panic. This is kind of hysterical feeling because they are losing the dear ones. The dear ones, al-Nusra and ISIS. That's why Israel now is panicking recently, and we understand their feeling.
Well, Israel is now seemingly striking across Syria, airstrikes at will. They're boasting publicly on camera again and again that your defenses, they're powerless to stop them, that they can do in Syria whatever they want. Is that true? Is there anything you can do to stop Israel carrying out its airstrikes in Syria?
Yeah. Actually, the first target of the mercenaries in Syria was the air defense. Before attacking any other military base, it was the air defense. And you would be surprised at that time, why do they attack the air defense? The air defense will not deal with the peaceful demonstrators, as they say, or the moderate forces, and it cannot deal with extremists anyway. It's another thing, it's to defend the country. This is the other proof that Israel was in direct link with those terrorists in Syria. So they attacked those bases and they destroyed big part of our air defenses. Now, in spite of that, our position, let's say our air defense is much stronger than before, thanks to the Russian support, and the recent attacks by the Israeli and by the American and British and French proved that we are in a better situation. Now the only option, my answer to your question, is to improve our air defense. This is the only thing that we can do, and we are doing that.
In December of 2017, the Switzerland and EU-funded investigative group CAR, Conflict Armament Research, concluded a 3-year investigation into the Syrian arms trade and issued their report. They traced back the origin of more than 40,000 pieces of arms, ammunition, and explosive precursor captured from ISIS. CAR confirmed what many already knew. It had been clear early on when ISIS released footage of itself parading around in gun-mounted newly painted caravans of Toyota Hilux trucks that an outside state or states was supplying them. The Islamic State lacked the capacity to manufacture complicated things like TOW missiles, and yet they had them readily. The arms in Syria, according to the report, originated in former Warsaw Pact nations such as Bulgaria and Romania, which were purchased by the US and Saudi Arabia, who then, in violation of multiple arms treaties, retransferred the weapons to so-called moderate rebel groups in Syria who were trying to overthrow the government. Ultimately, they landed in the hands of ISIS. In addition, the CIA was also smuggling weapons out of Bulgaria to the Islamic State through intermediaries. Dilyana Gaitensheva, a journalist in Bulgaria, wrote from Sofia in the Trud newspaper her findings from a 3-month investigation. She found and filmed 9 underground warehouses full of heavy weapons from Bulgaria in East Aleppo. Her investigation uncovered the plot. Azerbaijan's state-run Silkway Airlines was offering hundreds of diplomatic flights to US SOCOM, Israel, United Arab Emirates, the Balkans, Turkey, and Saudi Arabian private arms companies. Diplomatic flights are not subject to inspection. Transporting military weapons in civilian aircraft is also illegal under the IATA, International Air Transport Association. After her report, Dilyana was interrogated and fired. An American company called Purple Shovel was one of the main contractors buying and shipping non-US weapons on behalf of SOCOM to rebel groups in Syria. Of the $1 billion in contracts issued between 2013 and 2016 December for non-US weapons, 100% of them used Silk Airways to transfer the weaponry. It is Iran-Contra 2.0. The U.S. publicly condemned arming the Contras and privately was arming them the entire time. The US publicly condemns arming ISIS, and yet the US has covertly been funding and arming them the entire time. But unlike Iran-Contra, no one has gone to trial, no one is held accountable. There was more propaganda about the banned Pussy Riot in Russia, which did lewd things in a church, than there has been on America arming Al-Qaeda. Again.
There's an uncivil war in Syria, 100,000 dead, millions of refugees without a food, without a roof over their heads, proxy armies flowing into a country open wide. You got Al-Qaeda and America fighting side by side. You got Saudi monarchs and French socialists on one team. You got Russia and Iran backing the regime. You got the Arab League having another meaningless debate, saying let's just see what happens if we wait. Now it's time to do the thing the West does best. Time to step in the hornet's nest. We don't know who did it, but there's been a war crime, so we'll bomb an Arab country one more time. What we know is this: there was a chemical attack, kinda like the ones that happened in Iraq, like the white phosphorus we used on the people of Fallujah, or the chemicals we sold to Saddam for Halabja. But this time it's a different story: the poison gas in Gucci.
It's a sweet song. Israel did 9/11 JB since 999. Great work exposing those who destroyed this beautiful country and turned half of its population into refugees. Yeah, well, the refugees are returning. Actual refugees. We're not talking about economic migrants in Europe. We're talking about real families that were forced to flee, actual refugees, war refugees. We noticed that 1.5 million returned after Aleppo was retaken, and more came back when Daraa was retaken. They're already reopening schools there for the kids. And so you can bet when Rojava is retaken that more refugees will be on the way. I just showed the film slightly before I had a special message plan, but I can just do it myself now anyway. But we had a long Q&A over an hour, and then we had 4 months worth of Syria updates where we showed how the Syrian army retook Daraa, retook Deir ez-Zor, retook Homs, and squished ISIS up into Idlib, which is where they are now. And I guess there's a little place in Al-Tanf, and that's already being reconciled as we speak. The U.S. has been counting inventory, and Al-Qaeda has decided to surrender, and they're trying to get to Idlib, but they really don't have any leverage, so Assad's not going to let them up there. He's probably going to throw them in prison. We shall see. But what I want to stress is the Israeli role in all of this. The Zionist war on the Levant, which is what, obviously the title of this film was, Israel's Invisible Hand. We've seen it come apart. And so Al-Tanf is already counting inventory and is poised to move to the Iraqi side of the border. So the U.S. is leaving Syria, but they're just going to set up like a roadblock on the other side, but it will be in Iraq. And then you've got Rojava, which has already started conceding Manbij. That started happening in the last 2 days. And the Kurds have no real choice, I don't care what Lindsey Graham says, other than to return territory or face a Turkish attack. That's reality. And Israel has been forced to show its hand. So the hand's no longer invisible. And that's exactly what they did with the 2018 Christmas bombing, which illuminated itself to the world. Israel is showing its hand, and this is Israel's downfall. They've painted themselves into a corner. They're going to lose Yemen. They've already lost Syria. The writing's on the wall. They did a huge air campaign on Christmas and did not hit a single target. They launched all the F-16s. They tried to, and they could not get their one primary target, which was that Iranian 747. So Israel is showing its limp dick, and there's nothing they can do, which makes you question what's going to happen in the Golan Heights. Now I'm going to allow the questions on the floor for a moment. I'll shut up, and I will let you... Well, first of all, what did you think? How was the film? Did you like that? Press, I don't know, just say yes or something. Well, I have a 9/11 question. Justro asks, what year did you figure out 9/11 completely? I don't know. I guess around 2003 I made all the connections to 9/11 in Iraq, and I already knew there had to be state sponsorship. I already knew the mass media was lying. There wasn't like a clear aha moment for that. Just kept learning more and more. I mean, once those dancing Israelis were busted, which was in 2001, I knew about that. It was pretty much over. Thanks, Q&A would be cool. F. Lindsey Graham, not really. That's gross, like Israel. Brett sent $5 to say that. Yeah, the only the only people Lindsey Graham's been messing with is his little kitty boys. Ryan Miller sends the donation. Is Greater Israel a realistic goal for the Jews? No, it isn't. It's dead in the water. They can try to colonize a little bit more of the West Bank. And that's about all they're going to get, and that's not going to be sustained for long either. They've lost Syria. They've lost Lebanon. When Israel went to war with Lebanon in 2006 and lost to Hezbollah, note, Hezbollah doesn't have an air force. The Lebanese military did not fight with Israel. Just Hezbollah did. And Hezbollah still beat them. And this was without any S-300s, 200s, or Russian air defense or anything. This was just Hezbollah, which is a militia group, versus the entire Israeli military. You're talking Navy, Air Force, everything. And they won. Israel lost. Because after 100 soldiers died, they couldn't stomach the casualties, and they quit. Israel could not get skin in the game. That's why they decided to use proxy forces, the same way that during the Cold War, the U.S. would use proxy forces in places like Nicaragua. Iran-Contra is a very famous example where the U.S. and Israel work covertly to create off-the-book budgets to pay for mercenaries to attack Nicaragua as a proxy force. Same things happen. The opium trade from Afghanistan has paid all these foreign fighters to pour into Syria, Sunni fighters especially, that composed up ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to try to topple Assad or get him to a position where he's going to get toppled and he'd be forced to negotiate and throw away pieces of his territory, like Kerry was saying in the film. But that's not what he did. He turned to Russia for support. They started beating the terrorists. Trump got elected, not Hillary. Trump cut off all funding for quote-unquote moderate rebels. And without that American support, a lot of the partner companies dropped out. Qatar first, followed by the UAE, and then Saudi Arabia. Turkey was the last one left, but Turkey's motive was blocking a pipeline to the Mediterranean from Iran, which was done, and their other motive was to kill the Kurds. And so Turkey's backing ISIS to kill the Kurds, not to destroy Syria. And if they can get the Kurds out of Syria another way, they will, and that's what they figured out, and that's where we are now. So, yeah, we had an hour-long Q&A and 4 months of Syria updates, and Vimeo erased them all. Vimeo erased 6 years of my work, all my films, and took 2 months' worth of profits, about $5,000, because September is the best month for September 11th movie, and they just stole all the money. So if you're in New York, you're welcome to protest them. You're welcome to write them a letter. I'm hoping we'll get donations for this film, and that this could be the way of the future, because I would like more of the public to see these films, but I also have to pay for them, so it's catch-22. So if some of the public donates enough and they make enough revenue, then we'll start popping them out more frequently, and the ones that are already available can go public. And then I don't have to deal with the video on demand and code words and all this crap. I'll just make it public. This next problem will be, censorship. So I'll probably have to move it over to BitChute. So we'll see. But how was the film, guys? If you got it from the beginning to end, if you're here the whole time, why don't you press 1 so I know how many of you are here for the whole time. Because I think the stream dropped about 50 minutes in and had to reconnect. So we had all these people watching, and then just before I'm about to start the film, mysteriously it drops, right? Here we go. Here come the one. Okay, a lot of people. All right. And then there's a lot of things we could have talked about in the Syrian war.